It's 1969, and presidential speechwriter William Safire has written two speeches. The first speech is given July 20th, 1969. The second speech is never given. Only a few people in the inner circle of the White House knew about the second speech. Details of that second speech got disclosed publicly about 30 years later. And to say that the major participants were shocked at the details is probably an understatement. That second speech involved two women, a minister, and what many would have considered to be the most heartless decision that NASA had ever made. I'll tell you more about that speech and another presidential speech that was never given in this edition of Prez Politics. It's October 1962, and the United States has discovered that there are some long-range missiles that have been placed there by the Soviet Union in Cuba, which is some 90 miles off of our shores. As President Kennedy met with his military advisors, the ExComm, to discuss what options there were, they talked about diplomacy, but they also very seriously talked about a full-scale ground invasion of Cuba to take out those missiles. And we know that after much debate, Kennedy decided on a naval quarantine of Cuba instead, which cut off any additional shipments of missiles. For 13 straight days, a tense standoff occurred between the Soviet Union and the United States. We call it the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the closest we ever came to World War III. And luckily, in the end, the Soviets backed down and withdrew the missiles, and much to everyone's relief, war was avoided. But during the early debate, a speech was written for President Kennedy. Should he decide on a full-scale ground invasion, it was really a doomsday speech. Details of this speech was disclosed in 2012 by the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum on the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, it's interesting that the major speechwriter for President Kennedy was a man by the name of Ted Sorensen. And he didn't support a ground invasion, and he refused to write the speech, and the speech was written by someone else instead. Stay tuned at the end of the video for my bonus feature, and I'll tell you a little bit about the time that I had an opportunity to meet Ted Sorensen. Take a look at the excerpts here of the speech, and you see it's very straightforward. President Kennedy says he has a heavy heart. He's upheld his duty as Commander-in-Chief. He's launched an invasion of Cuba with conventional forces only, and it's all for the sole purpose of removing those weapons, those missiles from the soil of Cuba. But thankfully, President Kennedy never had to give that speech. It's 1969, and there's a race to get to the moon between the Soviet Union and the United States. And we know that in 1969 here, the United States launched Apollo 11. We were the first to reach the moon. Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon, and he and Buzz Aldrin spent about 2.5 hours walking on the surface of the moon. But there's one big question that was lingering over everyone's mind at NASA. Would the Eagle lunar module be able to ignite and burn for at least 7 minutes to get them off of the moon's surface and allow them to reconnect with the command module that was being piloted by Michael Collins? Well, they overshot their landing spot by about 4 miles. They lost extra fuel while trying to find a spot to land on the moon. And when they did land, they only had about 45 seconds worth of fuel left in the landing tank. And so all these scenarios have been bounced around. What if when they go to launch, it doesn't launch? It then would sort of put Aldrin and Armstrong on a race to try and make the necessary adjustments to fix whatever needed to be fixed to get them off of the moon's surface before their oxygen ran out. Armstrong later says that he figured their chances were 50-50 at best. The astronauts knew the inherent risk and danger of this mission. You know, did you know that they couldn't even get life insurance policies? While they couldn't get life insurance policies, they did come up with a clever way of being able to take care of their families in the event of emergency. And if you stay tuned at the end of our video, I'll tell you a little bit about that in our bonus feature. Very interesting story. Prior to Apollo 11's launch, President Nixon's speechwriter, William Safire, prepared 2 speeches. Well, the first speech President Nixon did end up giving when he called and congratulated the astronauts with their landing on the moon. The second speech was never given. It was a doomsday speech. In fact, it was entitled "In the Event of a Moon Disaster." And the protocol would have called for, at that time, had something happened, President Nixon would call Mrs. Armstrong and Mrs. Aldrin, and then he would give the prepared speech to the nation. A minister would then commend the souls of the astronauts to the deepest of the deep, just as if, just in the same manner that a naval chaplain would do for those lost at sea. The Lord's Prayer would be read, and then NASA would make what many would have probably considered to be a heartless decision. They would have cut off all communication with the astronauts. Now, there were about 600 million people that were watching the moon landing on television worldwide that day. And luckily, that second speech never had to be given. On July the 21st, the lunar module fired properly. It allowed them to redock with the Columbia and Collins. 3 days later, they landed back on Earth safely, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean. But if Nixon would have needed to give that speech, this is what it might have looked like and sounded like.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind. Good night.
Remember I told you about Ted Sorensen, the speechwriter for President Kennedy, who refused to write the Doomsday speech in the possible invasion of Cuba? Well, I got to meet him in 2010. I heard him speak in Charleston, West Virginia, discussing the 1960 presidential election, the Democratic election held in West Virginia, which really helped propel John Kennedy to the White House. And Sorensen was the one that later wrote Kennedy's famous inaugural speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." It was great listening to Sorensen speak that night. You know, he had a stroke about a decade earlier in 2001, which affected his eyesight. But I found his mind was still sharp. He still remembered great details from the past, and he had a sense of humor. My 9-year-old son got to have his picture taken with Sorensen afterwards. And Sorensen was joking and said, "Hey, when you run for president one day, you can use this picture. It'll help you get famous." And I had him sign his classic book that he wrote on President Kennedy. I then asked him to sign the jacket cover because I wanted to have it framed. And he looked at me and he says, "Are you sure you want to do that? Because that's going to be hard to sell on eBay one day." And he was a very gracious and a kind man, and a man who had been in the arena of politics for many, many years and still enjoyed talking about them. Remember I told you that the astronauts couldn't get life insurance? Well, they couldn't. No insurance company could really figure out what the odds were of them living or dying, and they couldn't put a dollar amount on it. So what the astronauts did was they signed a bunch of autographs just before launching, gave them to their wives, and in the event of their death, their wives would take those autographs and sell them and hopefully help provide a little bit of a financial future for their families. And I once read that an autograph, an Apollo 11 autograph, insurance autograph, that is authentic and dates back to that time would run somewhere today around $30,000, believe it or not. Hey, if you liked our video today, give us a thumbs up. If you haven't already subscribed to Prez Politics, do that right now.